If you're a PhD student or a researcher who's doing qualitative research, then this video is going to be a real treat for you, because this is going to be a recording of a live masterclass with Dr. Marek Kiczkowiak, who's got an amazing, probably the best YouTube channel on qualitative research, and he did a special exclusive live masterclass for my research paper mastery clients. And normally, to get access to these sessions live and be part of research paper mastery program, people pay over $5,000, but you can watch a part of this session completely for free right now. And in this session, Dr. Marek Kiczkowiak goes over all the most common questions, problems, mistakes when it comes to doing qualitative research. He also talks about how to design qualitative studies. He talks about how to structure a research paper for a qualitative studies. He talks about some of the most common risks and mistakes that people, researchers, PhD students make when it comes to designing qualitative studies. So if you are doing a qualitative study as a PhD student or a researcher, this video is going to be a real treat. It's going to answer all the questions that you've ever wanted to ask about qualitative research. So let's dive right in.
There are other considerations. Again, I won't go into detail of everything that have to do with that insider status. You have to also be careful. You know, there are many things, possible risks associated, for example, assumptions about shared knowledge. That's what it's called in research, where, for example, I'm talking to, let's say, another Polish person, a Polish migrant. We are in the UK, and let's say we have a certain opinion about, I don't know, British people, and I'm interviewing that person, and he says, you know what the British people are like, and I'll say, oh yeah, I know. And this is a bad thing, because he never said that, and I cannot use it as data. It's a shared assumption. We're both assuming that we know, but it's not counted as data. So that's one of the risks of being that insider. And also something to remember about research in general, you have to always gather that data. The person has to say that. So if somebody says, you know what the English people or whatever the British people are like, I have to say, can you please clarify, what do you mean, what are they like? So this person actually says it, because then I'll be analyzing data. I need that person to say it. So that's pretty important. And of course, like I said,
can I ask something related to it, Marek? So, like, I imagine that you also have to be careful about asking leading questions. You know, if you're an insider and you kind of like, you might have shared assumptions. Would it also be bad if you just sort of ask questions that lead the participants to say a certain thing that you want them to say?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's also a very risky thing, and also something a little bit vague, because often people struggle with it and they ask me, you know, how do I know the question is not leading? But yeah, of course, an example, like a, let's say, hardcore, you know, example of a leading question would be something, you know, where I'm saying, why do you think Americans like, I don't know, something, you know, so much? So I'm already, it's a bad question. I'm assuming they like it, right? I'm kind of imposing that view on you, because I'm saying, why do you think they like it? I never asked you if they like it in the first place. So that's one of the examples where I'm kind of imposing my view. So of course you have to remain as objective, as neutral as possible. You have to tell your participants as well that, you know, even when I ask about something, I'm not expressing my opinion. I want to know your opinion. But of course there is always some risk, because they may be thinking, there are all kinds of research risks in qualitative research, of course, because it has to do with people, and you know, we're never perfect, and therefore there are so many risks, and all these risks are referred to as respondent bias. So there are different forms of bias, but respondent bias is anything that has to do with that person. Maybe he or she is lying, maybe he or she is not telling the truth, maybe he or she thinks that I want her to say that. So all these things are different forms of bias, but then again, you have lots of strategies to kind of minimize that bias and make sure it doesn't happen. But it's always some form of a risk. The same thing can be said about research questions in general, not interview questions. Another common problem is, again, as I started to say about research questions, are questions that are already implying something, suggesting something. So just like I said, if my research question is, why do British people like something, you know, fish and chips? It's not a good question, because you should be asking, do British people like fish and chips? That's a good research question. And I may have a second research question saying, if they do, why? That's a good, again, two research questions. But if I'm just asking why do they like it, not a good research question. So another very common problem with research questions is assuming things. Another problem is having questions where you have several questions in one question. Why do people like fish and chips, and what do they do when, I don't know, when they eat it? It's two questions. Again, not a good question because, you know, you're asking about two different things. So some common mistakes, like I said, there are plenty of mistakes that I could go through, but let me make sure first to even answer, you know, all the questions.
I can see that Natasha here has a question on like we kind of going into it in a different direction now with Natasha's question, but you know, she says one of her comments that she received on her article was that she needs to separate discussion from the results section in a qualitative research paper. That, you know, you have results separate and discussion separate. Have you seen that this is like always a rule, or it just depends on the journal, or?
It's funny that you should ask, because it's the discussion chapter is definitely one of the least fixed and structured and obvious chapters. It's something that again, every week I address that. Every week I talk about it with people because it's one of the most vague chapters, because there are so many ways to write it, so many things you can put there, and so many different standards for writing it. So yes, traditionally the discussion and results are two different things. And so first I'll explain what they are. So the results are basically, it's a report of your results. So you're saying, I found this, this, and this. The participants believed into the, in this. The participants did that. That's the reporting, let's say, the results. And then the discussion, it's there are two things. Like I said, there are so many things that can go there, but two things that absolutely have to go into the discussion. One thing is the literature, so that's how it's different. In the results and or the findings, whatever it's called, you don't bring in any literature, you're just talking about your findings. But then in the discussion, you're tying these findings back to the literature. So in the literature review, you introduce certain literature, you taught the reader about your topic, then you're showing them, obviously you're talking about your methodology, that's usually the next section, and then your results, you're showing the results. In the discussion, you're taking these results that you already showed to your reader has a good understanding of what you found, and then you're tying that back to the literature that you presented in the literature review. So that's
if you were writing a research paper, would you always separate the findings from the discussion?
So that
in a qualitative research paper, not a thesis, but if you were writing a paper for publication.
Yeah, that would be, so that's the next point. So I'm just first establishing what goes where traditionally, but and of course in the discussion, and the second part that's usually in the discussion is some kind of a discussion, so some kind of interpretation, whether you're surprised, whether it's something is surprising or not surprising, so any kind of subjective views. Quite often in the discussion, people also kind of talk about what next, what this means, what we do about it. But now, as you're asking, and it can be, for some people, including myself, it may feel a little bit artificial and not natural to distinguish between these two things, because we're kind of naturally inclined and tempted to talk about, one and the other at the same time. So when I'm showing you the results, it's kind of tempting to say, okay, well, is this the same as this guy did, 5 years ago? So there is depending on, as you said, you're talking about journal articles, depending on the journal, but then depending on the institution, if you're a student doing your dissertation, some do allow to merge both, so the discussion and the results together. It really depends just on that institution. Some people say it's allowed, you can have a results and discussion basically together. So you're showing the results and commenting on, this result, this is what they said, this is similar to what these guys did in their study. So it really depends just on that, on the institution. For students and the universities, it's more flexible than it may seem. Students usually are afraid to ask, but usually if they do ask, then even if the university traditionally shows you the template where there is a findings and discussion, usually they are basically okay. They don't really mind if you do that together or separately. And the journal, in journal articles, I imagine it's probably a little bit stricter than that, because they usually do have their templates and the requirements. So it really depends on, I would say, on the journal. They usually do have a template, right? They tell you what they want, if they want discussion and results or just results or whatever it is. So you have to follow that. I'm afraid it's always easier if you're allowed to put them together, because it's just easier for many reasons. It's easier to kind of mask some of the imperfections even of your study. If, for example, I have a little bit less to say about a certain result, but more to say about the literature, I can just, focus more on the literature with that specific result. If maybe there is no previous literature that talks about this result, on the other hand, I can focus more on some quotes from the data. So it's just much easier and better, I find, when you are allowed to mix the two. But like I said, it depends. And I want to also
it looks like it depends a lot. And I like my experience has been very similar, that I've written qualitative papers when results and discussion were together, and I've written ones where it was completely separate. So I think it really depends. Is it okay if we move to questions from Tien here, because she has a couple of questions, some of which I think are the same questions that people asked in the discussion, so it might be useful, like that one about participants. How many participants is enough? And I feel other researchers here have asked me that question before, and I'm not sure if I ever had a good answer to that. So I was wondering what you think, Jarek, if there is like a good number of participants for a qualitative study.
Yeah, it's definitely that. I've been keeping that question for later because I know it's a very common question. As you know, it's not an easy question to answer. So first, part of the answer is something that you'll probably read in textbooks, but it has to be said that the number of participants will be determined by, for example, such variables as firstly the quality and the length and the level of detail of, for example, interviews, if we're talking about interviews. So of course you can have I've seen 20, 30, 40 interviews sometimes, but they were so short and lacked detail. They were worse than sometimes I've seen 5 or 6 interviews that were helped me generate much more insight and many more findings. So of course it depends on the quality, the length of the interview and the quality of the interview, because again, you can have a long interview, but the questions are being asked not very skillfully. Another common problem, I analyze the data mostly all the time, every day, and I see a lot of that when I work on the data that I did not collect. I just analyze the data somebody else collected. And so of course it's a whole different topic, how to conduct good interviews. I have plenty of videos about that on my channel as well. But so that's the first response, and something you'll see in textbooks saying it depends. But then, of course, as a student especially, you're expected to justify why you choose a certain number of participants, and that's a problem because it constantly happens. If you say, well, they had 5 interviews or they had 10 or 15 in their study, the next thing that's said to you is, okay, so is that just because somebody else did it, you're gonna do it? So there's really very difficult to talk to your supervisor or other people about your number of participants. So the thing I recommend doing, I have a blog article about it, I have a video about it. It's almost like a strategy that I developed to kind of address this problem. And namely, there is one of your questions also asked about saturation. There is a concept of saturation of your findings, of your data, which means when you're analyzing the data, there is a certain point, ideally, where you start feeling and finding that your findings are pretty, let's say, similar, or you're not really finding anything new and groundbreaking. Of course, as many things and many concepts in research, this concept has also been questioned, and people say, well, you will always find something if you add more to your study. And it's true, you will, but anybody who has done data analysis will agree that after a certain point, there is this moment when you're kind of feeling, okay, it's more or less similar. I may not need to add any more. So that's the concept of saturation. And now, of course, you don't know when that moment appears, because again, this depends on whether you have good interviews and long interviews. But there are studies that analyzed other studies. So there are authors who gathered data from other studies, hundreds and hundreds of research papers, and they specifically did that to explore how many transcripts were needed for these other researchers to reach the point of saturation. So they started to make conclusions. For example, for a case study, I think it's about 15 or something. For grounded theory, it's usually between 20 and 30. So basically, they developed these studies exploring other studies, and therefore, when defending your decision, for the number of participants, it's always a very good strategy to refer to these studies and say, look, these guys, they explored hundreds and hundreds of other papers. They said, for example, 15 to 30 participants is enough. So therefore, I will start with, here is the number. In a second, I'll say what I think is a good number. But let's say I start with 15. If I don't reach saturation, I will recruit more. But 15, based on that previous research, is the number I will start with. So that's usually what I recommend doing. And now, yeah, so what is that number actually? So what is it? Should it be 15 or 20? Very hard to tell. I would say that on average, but remember, it's just an average, nothing more. So I'm not saying this is the right number. But on average, I find that 15 is a very safe number, for example. It's really hardly ever have I seen the need for more. It kind of depends on the institution. If you're doing a PhD, somebody may say, oh, for a PhD level, you should try to have 20, for example. But of course, some people have 50 something. But I find that more often than not, 15, 20, very safe numbers. But again, I've seen studies with 10 and I've seen studies with 5 interviews. There are in fact studies with 1 person that go into really much depth or experience of that 1 person. But yeah, when we talk about averages, that will be anywhere between, let's say, 10 and 20 or 25. And I already told you the kind of a response that I recommend that you provide for as a starting point. Always say this is a starting point. If I need more, if I don't reach saturation, I'm willing to gather more data. So yeah, so that's about the number.
And that point about saturation that you mentioned, is it also related to, because Tien here was asking, when you interview participants, how do you know you have enough information and you can just stop? So is that also that issue of saturation?
Not exactly. It's the interview. I mean, it's a good question as well. You should have, and that's something extremely important. For every interview, you should have an interview guide. So that's another whole art of developing, an interview guide that is good, that will help you answer the questions and get the answers to your research questions. So this is always your backup. You absolutely have to have an interview guide. So things that you're kind of a plan for the interview. So basically, obviously, like the first criterion would be you do want to go through the questions that you intended to ask. So that's more or less, what determines the interview. But then, of course, during the interview, there will be things like you're going off topic, things like that. I would say, like I said, the starting point should be your interview guide. Plus how many, how much time the participant has, because you can't sit there, for 5 or 6 hours. So it's kind of, I would say, it's very hard to kind of scientifically answer that question, but in practice, in real life, what happens is that, firstly, you will be very happy and very lucky if you find that, it's been a while and the participant is still talking and you're wondering, where do I stop? Usually it's the other way around. It's usually the problem of, how do I get them to talk? So it's not that common, that this happens. But like I said, if that happens and you're wondering, well, just make sure that you have asked the questions that you plan to ask. You're asking follow-up questions. You're flexible in how you're asking questions. Again, I have plenty of videos just about interviews. In fact, I have a whole self-study course about interviewing. So it's a course on Udemy. In a second, I'll prepare maybe a link as well. But that's more or less what happens. You should always go into the interview fully prepared. There is no other way. Yes, there are some approaches where the interview is not structured, but it's a completely different story, and it's a completely different type of a study. So people, for example, exploring, like becoming part of some community, of indigenous population, they live with them, and then kind of, they do the interviews in a very spontaneous way. So it's a completely different thing. But normally, you have an interview guide.
Yeah, there is a mindful of the time as well. And I think that's a question from Tien, who's on the call here, and I think somebody else maybe asked that question as well in the discussion. How do you code information? I think there was a question about coding.
Coding, and I know there are questions about themes, and there is a question about coding tips. There is so much. Again, it's a whole story, whole topic on data analysis. But overall, it's in a nutshell, coding is not as scary, as it sounds. It's just basically moving through the transcript of your data. So let's say if you interviewed people, later you want to transcribe it, you want to have it in a written form, you're moving through that and you're basically almost like tagging what they're saying. So assigning little keywords or sentences, little summaries to what they are saying. So somebody's telling you their, challenging experience at work, you literally select it and call it challenging experience at work. Whether you're doing that on a piece of paper with highlighters, or using software, or using, specific software data analysis, or using even Microsoft Word. The point is to kind of start tagging, describing these little topics that appear. And eventually, like I said, it's going to be a huge simplification and summary, because of course, I can't now describe the whole process, but eventually you create lots of these tags or these little codes. They give you insight into the data, because later you're looking at all these topics that were discussed, and then you start to organize these codes. So basically trying to remember and understand everything that's been said during the interviews. How can you do that? You can't, even if you have 5 interviews, you'll never remember every single thing that every person said. That's why you need the codes. You eventually have a list of codes. You start to kind of organize them into groups. So for example, here are all the codes that have to do with negative experiences. Here are all the codes that have to do with emotions. So you start to organize these things, and as you do that, you're organizing your understanding, your knowledge of your data, and only this way you can eventually develop such good understanding of this data that you can start deciding on what themes run through your data. So thematic analysis, themes are nothing else but topics running through the data. You cannot simply take a look at all the data and state straight away, here are the themes, here are the main topics, here are less important topics. You have to kind of build that understanding from scratch, and this is how you move from these very detailed codes to eventually start moving them to groups and thinking about the themes. In terms of the tips, the best tip, and something I always start with when I talk about coding, is it's always better to have too many codes than not enough codes. You have to be very detailed with your codes. That's my number one tip. But again, of course, there's so much more on this topic. If you manage, Marek, to find, for example, a video called Thematic Analysis Explained in, I think, 5 minutes on my channel, you can also paste it here, because it's kind of a nice summary of the whole process. But then, of course, I have a whole playlist of just videos about thematic analysis and coding. So, and I know some of them have been extremely useful and popular. But yeah, in a nutshell, that's what data analysis is. It's much less intimidating and overwhelming and scary than people seem to believe. And every time, I kind of explain the process, they feel usually relieved when they understand that it's really quite common sense. It's just trying to understand your data and systematize and reduce this volume of the data. Because like I said, you can't just understand and remember every single thing that every person said. Therefore, you use the codes to really reduce that volume and summarize that data for yourself. So that's what coding is.
Becky asked in the discussion in the community that she had that especially in grounded theory, you should avoid presenting very long quotes. Sometimes in qualitative studies you see quotes presented as almost separate paragraphs, right? And she's saying that she's been advised to use shorter quotes that are kind of part of your sentences and part of your embedded in the paragraphs, especially in grounded theory. But I don't know, what's your experience with that?
It's in fact an advice that I often give myself as well, give to other people with embedding the quote. So basically, not just in grounded theory, but there are certain risks associated with over relying on long quotes. Of course, I've seen plenty of examples where people, I'm not saying, Becky, that's your writing, but I see a lot of students really over relying on long quotes. So basically, instead of, let's say, explaining and guiding the reader through what's been found and supporting that with the quotes, they're showing me one quote after another with hardly any discussion. For example, that's one mistake. Like I said, not necessarily what you did, and just saying common mistakes. So they basically say participant 10 said, and there is a quote, and also participant 11 believed that, and there is a quote. That's not a good way to report, because you should guide me through it. So even if you're using that, I know I'm still not answering exactly your question, but I'll get there. Even if you're doing that, you should tell me, in the following extract, the participant 10 explained how, during COVID-19 pandemic, she struggled in her work. And there, I see the quote, and I already know at least why it's there, what I'm looking for, more or less. So that's one thing that should be done. But then, of course, in general, you shouldn't have too many quotes that are long. If you do have it, then you really have to make sure to guide through, every single thing in that quote that you want the reader to pay attention to. Regarding the guidelines, again, it's kind of, I guess it varies, but it's often said that 3 or 4 lines is the maximum before you indent it. So you put it in the middle, like Marek said. So you can, so that's another kind of related thing. So sometimes people also have too long, a quote in the text. That's another problem. After 3 lines, I believe it should be indented already, or 4 lines according to some standards. And then once you do indent it, then it's just, I don't think there is a specific rule that says, how long is acceptable. But if you have a really long quote, for example, it's better to break it down even into 2 quotes, because again, of what I said before, because you have to guide the reader and make sure that, everything in that quote is important, and also explain why and what is important. So very often, as I said, I give that advice saying incorporating quotes, evidence basically, because that's what they are, from your data into your own sentences is another way. It's better. It makes the whole reading more engaging. You're providing a lot of evidence without having this kind of disjointed quotes in the middle. So it's just a standard way that to make everything more engaging, I guess, and interesting. I'm just looking at your question to see if I even answer your question, but I think how long needs to be. Like I said, there is no rule for how long, but I would say, well, it's very uncommon to have even half a page, for example, as a quote. Although this happens sometimes, and suggestions for how to make it smaller. Like I said, I very often do that. If you have a quote and you already feel, okay, I've just provided another quote that's kind of been indented, all I do is break it down into smaller pieces and incorporate it into my writing. Simple as that. So I will say the same thing with my own words, and only using even 3 or 4 little quotes in that long sentence, or in 2 or 3 sentences. So that's what I usually do if I really want to communicate that. And again, like I said, for all kinds of reasons, it makes it better, because it kind of shows that it's also your opinion, and you're kind of explaining and guiding the reader whilst also providing evidence from the text. So that's usually what I do.
And I can see, I don't know, we have like 2-3 minutes to end, but I can see one question from William in the discussion that I don't think we've answered, and it's an interesting question. Like, so how do you present qualitative data if you have different sources of data? Like he says, I have document review, I have survey, I have interview data in my research that I want to present. So how do I suppose the question is, how do you combine in qualitative research different sources of data together, and how do you present them?
Yeah, it's also a very common consideration, and something that people often ask me. And another thing in qualitative research to which the response is it depends. There's so many questions where that have the same response. So basically, it depends mainly on you and how you decide to present it. And by that I mean, in all cases, you should start the analysis separately. So that's another important thing. So even if you have, let's say you have focus group interviews and individual interviews, even if it kind of feels similar, you still have to do the analysis separately. So all the coding, all the themes, everything separately. In your case, of course, it's even more obvious because there are different types of data, so documents, surveys, interview data. You always do that separately. And then how you present it will really depend on how you feel you want to build that, that structure. Sometimes you have, for example, you have the main data source, you have interviews, and then just a little bit of insight from the documents, but you don't feel that there's enough, for example, for the whole section or chapter. You can then have a section or chapter that's generally called the results. You can focus and you can explain to the reader that you're focusing mainly, most of the findings come from the main data set, which are the interviews, and they will be supplemented by additional findings from the documents. So in which case you kind of mix it up, merge it together, and you present the interview findings and then provide whenever necessary, whenever relevant, you can, for example, add an interesting insight from the document that supports what you're saying when you're discussing the interviews. But then, of course, you can have separate sections, which is, let's say, also a common way. So separate sections for the documents, separate for surveys, separate for interviews. You may, but don't have to, again, have a section at the end where you kind of bring all that together and comment on it. Although this is also one of the things you can do in the discussion, which is something we already covered. So you can first present all these 3 findings from these 3 different data sources separately, and then in the discussion start commenting on all that. What do we make of it? What does it mean together? So yeah, so like I said, there are so many different ways. It kind of relates to also what you do with the data itself. So like I said, even if you start separately, so you have, for example, focus group and interview, or even document and interview, you may end up having similar themes if it's similar topics. So sometimes you can, like I said, you always start separately, but sometimes you can at the end either decide to keep them separately, or you can decide to merge these 2 thematic frameworks. If they are, for example, very similar, and you feel that it's a good idea, you can merge them and again present them in one section, explaining which, let's say, finding comes from which data source. So what it really communicates as well about qualitative research is, I know it doesn't always help. Sometimes it does, sometimes it overwhelms people, but almost every single thing, and even what I've been discussing today, is very flexible in qualitative research. If you have a way to justify it, how you, for example, whether you present it separately or present it together, or what you put in your discussion, is very flexible, as long as it makes sense, and you're justifying what you're doing. That's kind of a bottom line, in qualitative research, that it's really not as structured and scientific, like I said, as for example, quantitative research, where it seems that there is just more, let's say, fixed rules to follow. In qualitative research, which is what I like specifically, but also what scares so many people, is that there is a little bit less of that structure. So yeah.
Now, if you enjoyed this video and you want live access to these masterclasses, and you want to be part of my program Research Paper Mastery, where we help people to write 3 or more papers every single year for Scopus-Indexed journals, then book a free one-to-one consultation. The link is right below this video. We're going to go over your main challenges, pinpoint your goals, and then see if working together is actually a good fit. And then if it is, we're going to roll up our sleeves, get into the trenches with you, and guide you step by step, show you our system so that you can also publish 3 or more papers every single year. So book that free one-to-one consultation below this video.